Juliet, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you giving the time and also for everything that you're doing currently for the world of work. As I tell people all the time, workplace health, organizational health is what I'm currently obsessed with. I've written a book about it. We'll talk a little bit about that later. We'll also talk about the book that you've written. But I wanted to kind of refresh. If I've never told you this before, I just want to kind of tell you where I first heard about you and your work, because it is quite a story.
Yeah, that would be
So
fun.
2 years ago, I want to say I was, and keep in mind, I'm someone that listens to probably 200 to 300 podcast episodes in total every year. So if any part of any of them stand out to me, it's kind of a miracle because I listen to so many of them. But I was walking around a pond where I usually get my exercise in, one of the many places here locally. And one of the podcasts I listened to regularly at the time was the Carey Leadership podcast. And he generally had some really good guests who were business authors and business leadership experts. And so I do a couple of things that I remember from that interview was, number one, I remember your last name thinking, I wonder if she's related to Alan Funt. And I just kind of assumed that you were, because Funt's not a super common last name, right?
Yeah.
And
You're
the
dating
second
both
thing,
of us right now, by the way. There's a lot of younger listeners who are not going to know who you're talking about, but you can explain it to them.
yeah. So I first heard of the name Funt, Alan Funt, back in probably the 80s or so. There was a reboot of a show that had been very popular a couple of decades before called Candid Camera. And I think like every decade there's like a new reboot of Candid Camera, it seems like. And so yes, I remember my parents saying, "Oh yeah, that's the show that Alan Funt did a couple decades ago," and I'd never forgotten. And of course, we watched the show pretty regularly. So when I heard you on Carey's show, that was my first thought: is I wonder if she's related to Alan Funt. It turns out you're actually his daughter. And the second thing that really stood out to me that day is you were talking about things like workplace health, organizational health, and the ties of those things to productivity. And you mentioned some things that really stood out to me. And I've told people on LinkedIn before that you have a principle about when it comes to scheduling, when it comes to your meeting schedules, about not letting the colors touch. And that's something that I think that most people nowadays in the world of work have such issues with, are overscheduling and not having any breaks, any time to do any creative work between the appointments that they have. And I don't know if that's going to be going away anytime soon. In fact, if anything, that seems to be accelerating or becoming more and more the norm. But just to kind of reset things, because again, you wrote this book, A Minute to Think, which is fabulous. I recommend it to everyone. And I was, even though this is a 270 plus page book, I was able to read this book in 1 weekend, literally in one setting, not because I'm a speed reader, but I was able to read it in one setting because I couldn't put it down, because everything that I learned, I thought, man, that's so good. Let me write down some things I need to do right now. Let me see what else this book has to say. And literally just a few hours later, I was done reading the book. So recommend that everybody get it. But since you wrote the book and published it, released it 2 years ago, tell us about where you see the world of work and how it relates to people's health at work.
Oh, that's a very good starting point, because our mission as a company and my mission as a person is to harmonize well-being and organizational excellence. Because there's a misunderstanding that if you're good to the people, it dings the business. And if you foster the business, it dings the people. But the truth is that in an ideal situation, they are harmonic. And it is a very difficult time right now to look at that. And you'll play this podcast for many years to come. And I don't think that what we're in anytime soon is going to change. So I feel pretty confident saying that whatever we experience from COVID forward has given people a very unique sense of exhaustion coupled with denial, just a passionate need and a fear-based need, I think, too, as things keep changing and people feel so unstable, to just keep grinding along and grinding along. And then over on this side, companies and bosses are under resource constraints and recession fears, and rifts are happening. And so there's this just diabolical combination right now of the most challenged in the sense of well-being, I think, maybe that we've ever been, combined with businesses that are really ratcheting down on people to work harder. And I'm very fearful for where this is going. I also know that all the therapists and all the calm apps and headspace and meditation and all that is fantastic. And I support it entirely. But it's not the same as going upstream from all of that and figuring out what are the predictable circumstances of work that are so
Mm,
taxing to human beings, and changing them. Giving a curative solution at the end when people are symptomatic is not the same as understanding the system that put them there. Because burnout is not a hangover, it's a chronic condition that only is one coming from work. And we really have to understand the sources as well as the curative options before us.
yeah, and when you talk specifically about burnout being a chronic condition, so I read your book, A Minute to Think, after I had already published my book called Make Work Better. And I'm telling you, when I come out with Make Work Better Part Two, I'm going to cite a lot of things in your book, in this book, and of course, give you credit for it. But in the beginning of my book, what I do is I spend some time talking about an article that was written by an organizational health expert whose name is Heidi Lynn Curter, and she wrote for Forbes.com literally a couple years ago, and she talks about 5 types of toxic workplace culture. The
Mm.
number one type of toxic workplace culture, according to her article, is the hustle culture. Now, as you work with businesses, is it safe to say that the glorification of hustle has led to the problems we see increasing at workplaces today?
Yes, and I would say, yes, I would agree with that statement. I think that the pace and cadence and frenzy and martyrdom of hustle culture is definitely a huge part of it. But there are offshoots of other influences. There is the fact that in public companies, bosses have to keep choosing between humanity and the quarterly shareholder call. There's the fact that individual people have not been taught good skills in boundary setting, brevity, communication, workflow, prioritization. They're just undertrained. They're under ready to step into that melee. And so if we give them behavioral tools, it doesn't have to be so exhausting. That's why we say that there's a harmonizing possible between well-being and organizational excellence. We didn't say, hey, little business over there, if you could earn a little less and push a little less and not compete as well, then the people will be well. We say they can both happen at the same time. And that has to do with changes that the bosses make and changes that the people are taught to make at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned something in your book that just stood out to me, and it is fed by the age of overload. Our assets can become our liabilities. Can you expand on that? Because that sounds like a lot of wisdom and truth packed into one pithy statement.
And well, I'm glad it was tight for you. We that's a whole chapter that you're summarizing there, because we were talking about now the thieves of time, which are the 4
Mm-hmm.
assets that tend to overgrow and become liabilities. So they are personality driven, but they are also behavioral. And you'll see that in the book we call the 4 thieves of time: drive, excellence, information, and activity. And if I had a slide up and we were doing a visual podcast as well, we would talk about the fact that in the age of overload, specifically in the midst of that hustle culture, each of them tends to morph and overgrow its pot. So a drive turns into overdrive, and excellence becomes perfectionism, and information becomes information overload, and then activity just becomes frenzy. And what they do is they keep seducing us with little stimulating wins. It's kind of like I just left my 16-year-old who's sick home in the living room, and he's getting those little hits from checking his phone, and I'm asking him not to, those little dopamine injections where we have a little win or we check a little box. But all that frenzy keeps us from the time to do deep work, historic wins, really move the business forward, really go toward our goals. And those 4 thieves are always going to keep tricking us into thinking that we're doing the most important work when we're not, because we like living in the realm of our own thief. So for instance, my dominant thief is excellence. We have a developmental assessment that our clients take and help them understand. And excellence for me is great until it becomes perfectionism. You talked about information overload when we were prepping. The thief of information is terrific until it morphs into information overload. And so for each of them, there's a sweet spot where we're using it for good and not for evil. And that's where we attempt to sit, but it's very, very hard.
Yeah, and specifically, because you mentioned information overload, here's what I've noticed, and this isn't true of every company that struggles in general, because I'm sure there are some companies in which, because of who the leaders are or who's on the leadership team, they suffer from different thieves within those four.
Oh,
But I
yes.
have a feeling that there are those that suffer from the thief of information that tend to be highly addicted to data, data reports, meetings about data and reports. What have you seen in your work with businesses? Have you seen what I've seen in some of my work, which is there are some people that spend a lot of time on data and information to the point that they're not really taking good action?
Oh, they're lost in it, lost dashboards and scoreboards and spreadsheets and slides. And you know what's funny is when we come in as outsiders who are very minimalist in our approach, and they send us the slide decks to get to know the data of the company, you can barely read the deck. It's so dense with 8-point font and charts and numbers. And you just imagine stepping into that world
Mm,
where you live there all the time. I could hardly imagine having room for a creative thought. And there, I think my favorite story in the book about the thief of information is a gentleman named Steve Martin who used to work for Microsoft. Do you remember this prank story? It's actually talking of my dad. It's the greatest efficiency prank of all time. He
mhm,
was a chief data scientist. They came to him and they said, sales team needs all this collateral. We want you to make 22 different pieces of stuff, PDFs and decks, etc., documents. And he had a hunch that it was overkill. He had a hunch that it wasn't really necessary, but he didn't want to say no. So what he did instead is on the second or third page of every asset, he put in the center, not in the footer, not in a sneaky place, a box that said, if you're actually reading this far, email me and I'll send you a $50 Amazon gift certificate. And of course, nobody ever wrote him, including the team that asked for the assets in their post-receipt review, never found the boxes because we just
mm,
don't need all this stuff. And I think that the skinnying down of that stream of information is one of the most profound changes that we walk companies through when we go into a company to be an influence of what we call being reductive, to reduce the
mm.
pile. That is the first line of defense. And it is amazing when people get objective about it, how much of it they realize is just pandering to one person who likes it, or accumulating extra data out of fear, or just panicking through the data without even actually thinking about why. It's everywhere.
Mhm. If you were to print T-shirts for any of your business consulting clients that communicating this, I love this in your book. And you call this the truth when it comes to the thief of information. Our human
Mhm.
brains can consume only so much information. We seem to forget that when we walk into the office. We seem
Oh,
to think we can take it all. And again, I've seen this to, happen to the detriment of most companies where, again, they get what, we've heard about analysis paralysis, but I also think that when it comes to information, the question that I started asking myself and those that I worked with in my clients like 10, 15 years ago, I started asking this question. What intelligence is actionable? Not what information is, but what is the actual actionable intelligence that you can use here? And so I just love the fact that you're addressing this because there is a temptation, I think, for most business experts and business authors to go data heavy and to wow and mesmerize their readers or their clients with data when it's just like, man, you're not doing long term, you're not doing your readers or your clients a service. It's better to tell them, like what they can cut out. So
let me give you an example, I think, of how we use data in the right way. And then let me give you some
mm,
solutions for people who are using data and information in the wrong way, because we want to get tactical in the podcast, I'm sure, to give
mm,
people some tips and tools. So, as an example, there was a study that came out of Oxford in the summer that said that well-being has now been officially correlated after studying 1,600 companies, that the profitability and value of a company is directly correlated to their well-being scores. Now, that for my work is clouds parting kind of data.
mm,
I will use that piece of data over and over and over and over and over for years to come. But that's pretty much all you'll hear about it, is a sentence or two summarizing the study, because it's all we really need to understand the impact. There will not be graphs, there will not be spreadsheets, there will not be pie charts, because we don't really need it to understand the impact. And if you think about just using enough data to create impact, it can be a real starting point. Another axis that is really great for people to think about is pull versus push on data and information. Now, what I mean by that is push is I throw you the football, and pull is I tell you, hey, there's a football in the back of the car. You can get it if you want. Mm-hmm. One, you have no choice and you're going to receive it. And the other, you can get it when you want. So all the things that we think people need to know, if you put them into pull-based repositories like Google Sheets, Google Docs, appendixes of slide decks, they can go there if they want. They can go there if they need. But what we want to really minimize is the push stuff. We want to minimize the amount of communication that we don't have a choice but to receive, whether it be oral or written. And when people start thinking about pull versus push, it really illuminates a lot for them. I was on a call yesterday with International Management Systems. It's a group of executives that get together, and one of the gentlemen was an expert, and they kept pulling him into meetings to report all the things that he knew. And we coached him to just create little Loom videos, asynchronous videos on Marco Polo or Loom that he could put in a file, and all those little updates would be in a file that he could update once a month. And when they wanted it, they could go get it, as opposed to pulling him in to all of the meetings. And so if you think of pull versus push, it will open up a lot of channels of reducing information.
Love that. And by the way, too, you mentioned there may not necessarily be data, although you mentioned the Oxford study. In my book, I quote, of all things, the World Health Organization, because they did back in 2017 a study. Now, they were calling it workplace health, but it was really workplace well-being. And so the lack of workplace well-being cost the global workforce $1 trillion a year. That was in 2017. Imagine how much more, that number is now with inflation and everything else. So yeah, it's costly. And there really is, it isn't an either or. It's not, well, we can be a healthy place, workplace where well-being is fostered versus we can be productive. They really do go, they go hand in hand. There's just no way to separate the two, even though people try all the time to separate the two. One of the things that I underlined and highlighted in your book, it's in chapter 5, you talk about the importance of value replacing quantity in our goals. And you said companies can learn to be reductive as they prune internal processes and layers of red tape. And getting back to something you said a few minutes ago, that sounds a little bit like a form of minimalism for companies. But what's the most, if you can share this, maybe without naming names, what's the most interesting example you've seen of a company that was buried in unnecessary processes?
Oh man, they all are. They all are. I'm trying to think of a specific example. There's a furniture company that we work with, and they're just topical because I just worked with them. But I'll tell you their story, but we need to go back a chapter so that everybody understands. You mentioned the word reductive. It's important to first say that when we talk about having a reductive mindset, that word has other meanings in English. But what we're talking about here is the mathematical use of the word reductive, because business is always going to be additive, and business can be, if you put the right lens on it, reductive. And we must have that reductive lens to balance. So we have to find times to cut, skinny down, chop, surrender, let go. So this furniture company is on my mind because I just spent 2 hours with their ELT, CEO, the top executives of the company. And what we do with them is we make them sit around a table. Everybody gets their own giant whiteboard on the wall, and everybody gets a stack of Post-it notes. And they begin looking through their to-do lists and their Asana and their OmniFocus and all the places where they keep stuff. And they're just asking themselves the simplification questions. Where can we let go? Where is good enough good enough? What do we truly need to know, and what deserves our attention? And you'll find it's amazing. I just have this fresh in my mind, and the Post-it notes begin to appear on the whiteboards of standing meetings that can be cut, of decks and processes that we really realize don't even need to be a deck, much less don't need to be as long or dense a deck. We find cadence issues where people are doing a report once a quarter that could be once a year, or once a week that could be once a month. We find meeting cadence issues, same thing. Once a week could be once a month, once a month could be once a year. And so I don't have a company that is popping to mind with a unique case of this particular kind of hives. It's every company. Every company, when you have an objective person come in from the outside, is absolutely drowning. And what's spectacular to watch in these planning sessions. In fact, I'm so excited by what happened in these last couple 2-hour executive sessions that we did. We might make this a feature during planning season, because planning season is when all the executives are putting all the stuff on the list, and then everybody else is going to suffer for an entire year because of the choices that stayed on that list. But if you could get them to be reductive during planning season, spectacular things could possibly happen. So it's really everywhere I walk, it's a blur, and it would be a little bit hard to separate out one particular offender. But I would think maybe, and then I couldn't say the brand anyway, because I couldn't say the name. So I'm thinking of one. It's a shoe company, and they had a lot of problems with aesthetics and decks and presentations and preparation. Some other companies will index in other areas.
Yeah, makes sense. And you mentioned meetings there. I've got a question I'm going to ask you, but in a few minutes, and I could literally spend an entire Zoom interview with you on just meetings. I have a lot of opinions. I know you have a lot of opinions about it. I think we've seen things for the last decades now where there's a lot of dysfunction in the area of meetings. But like I said, I'll get to that in a second. So one of the things I really appreciate about your book and your writing in general is that you're very good at coining new terms, and terms that basically describe something that nobody else had a term or a word or another way to describe it. You're like, hey, that's what that is. And you mentioned in chapter 8, it's a concept that you refer to as hallucinated urgency.
I thought that's where you're going.
Yeah, and its impact on how we work. So here's what you say. You say the faster and more reactive we are, the less we think first and act second. So what do you think contributes to this tendency? Because I can tell you that statement, the faster and more reactive we are, the less we think first and act second, that is the norm for the circles that I run in, unfortunately.
Oh, for everybody. I mean, you and I met in Georgia, and I'm new to Georgia from California. So I will tell you that the cadence of the South has helped a little bit. It's a little calmer down here, but boy, it's a stew of forces that make us move so quickly. And I think that some of them are very new forces that are adding to this. I think that there's been a panic-based urgency in corporate settings for a very long time. Then you layer on all the anxiety of the pandemic, and that gives another amplitude. I think recently there are two new forces that are speeding things up even more. I think AI is making everybody feel like everything has to go faster and faster and faster. I think even as influence as subtle as the fact that we listen to and watch podcasts and videos on 1.5 and 1.7 and double time, every message we see in every area is telling us we have to move faster. So in that cadence, in that metronome, we don't actually look at individual tasks that we're picking up and determine their individual urgency. We just flatline a sense of fake or hallucinated urgency across everything. And in our minds, we feel like my goal is always to do this thing, do this as fast as possible. That's the timeline that we set on everything. This as fast as possible, and then that as fast as possible. And it is a blisteringly tiring way to work. It also doesn't allow younger or newer workers any skill building in true prioritization. They don't have any idea because they just flatline the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the pioneers of the organizational health movement is a guy by the name of Patrick Lencioni. Full disclosure, I got to work with him and his organization for a couple years. His son, Connor, was the co-author with me on my book, Make Work Better. He has some interesting things. Yeah, that's right. He is. I've noticed that. Yeah. But he has a lot to say about meetings. Again, being the pioneer that he is in organizational health. What he is known for saying is that meetings are the most important activity in any organization. But I think we can all agree that meetings can be unnecessarily draining and counterproductive when they're not done well. So you wrote something interesting in your book. You said meetings should be our collaborative payoff after solo work. So related to that, what do most companies get wrong when it comes to planning meetings in general?
I'm trying to think back to Pat's. I know Pat is mostly about meeting quality
Mm.
within the meeting. Are there teachings that you love from Pat that are about meeting quantity that I should be cross-referencing my answer with?
Not necessarily quantity as much as you know, he's a big fan of the style of meetings. Like you have the daily stand up, which should be no more than 15 minutes. You have the weekly tactical, you have the quarterly offsite.
Love
So
them.
his are much more about focus. Like this meeting is about this, and what type of meeting it is really kind of runs the quantity and everything else. Yeah.
I love that you brought up Lencioni because his work and my work are really chocolate and peanut butter for the meeting culture. We are the perfect combination because he's going to take you to a laser-like appreciation of the value of every moment in a meeting and how to maximize it, how to create the right type of meeting, the right communication in meeting, the right theatrical excitement in meetings. And then I'm going to come along and get rid of a whole lot of the meetings that you don't need so you could focus those talents on the ones that matter. Because our focus really is on the massive quantity. I mean, we have a lot of content on quality of meeting within, but the first tranche of work, I would say, for most companies is to remove at least a third of the quantity. That's what people report when we ask them what feels unnecessary to them. It is usually at a minimum a third. And they're just on Zoom and multitasking because they're so bored, or they're doodling in the back of a room, or 14 people have been invited to something that could have taken 6, or 4 different people with redundant roles are sitting in the same room. It is an unquestioned environment of chaos that a mindful approach can so quickly and easily change if you have the ear of senior leadership. Very hard to grassroots it up on changing meeting culture, but if you're going top down, it's really extremely possible. I don't know if you know about Asana's meeting doomsday experiment,
Mm.
where the project management company Asana decided to take all standing meetings off of their calendar for 2 days and then mindfully and thoughtfully repopulate the calendar. And I can't bring the number to mind, but they saved a spectacular amount of time, and they made people feel like they had autonomy and agency because they were allowed to comment and consider each time they were repopulating one of those meetings. It was with intentionality as opposed to just with a mindless acquiescence to status quo. And that's what we need to do in every company, is really examine who's being invited, how long, how many, and the most important question, why are we meeting in the first place?
Yeah, that reminds me too. I've heard people have said this before, that sometimes when it comes to meeting minimalism, what helps leaders determine that they can cut a meeting is once they start to look at who they're naturally going to invite, and it's not necessarily because they should be invited, but maybe these people will come to all the meetings, they start to add up how much money those people are making for the duration of the meeting. Okay, if it's an hour long, wow, this meeting is going to cost, like, shouldn't all of these people be busy doing something else besides coming to yet another meeting where, like you said, they're going to be multitasking, they're going to be checking their text, their phones, they're going to be checking Asana to see what's, getting, what their team is getting behind on. So I love that too, because, and I'll tell you that I've had to, I've shared this story before with a few others, but there was one client that I had in the last year or so that loved to invite me to all kinds. Well, we should have Will there, shouldn't we? Okay, this was a client, not an employer, mind you. And I can remember looking at my calendar one week and seeing that they had invited me to 13 different meetings in the week.
Oh,
This is a
gosh.
client. And I thought, I'm going to have to start exercising some boundaries here, because it's not good for me. It's not good for my mental health, trust me. But it's also not good for them, because just because I can go sit in on a meeting where they say, let's get ready for the next meeting. And I say that tongue in cheek, but a lot of times it's true. I'll also share this because it reminds me of one of those clients. There was someone, because again, I mentioned this, that this was in your book, and in the talks you've given, you talk about not letting the colors touch when it comes to your schedule and your meeting schedule at that. And there was someone that, and I think it was at the same company that had invited me to 13 meetings, big surprise, in 1 week, where there was someone that was on a lot, if not all, these meetings that I was getting invited to. And I thought it was interesting. It's like almost every single meeting began with, hey, I just came from this other meeting. And then every one of those meetings would end with, I'm getting ready to go into this next meeting. And that's when it dawned on me, this person's job description could be summed up in one sentence: attend meetings all day long.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of those. And then we should unpack that rule before we get toward
Yeah.
our closing here, because
Yeah.
it's so important. So the thing that you're referring to, never let the colors touch, is a use of the tool called the wedge. The wedge is the most popular tool in the wide world of white space. It's just a wedge of time. You imagine inserting it like a carpenter's wedge to pry a pulpit open two things that were previously connected. So in between could be between finishing a project and picking up the next, or in between a question and an answer, or in between closing one window and opening the next. But in between a meeting and a meeting, what we want to see is stripes on the calendar with the rule, never let the colors touch, because we don't want to see that paint swatch of color, 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 color. Because when human beings are in the paint swatch, they can't think, they can't write a note, they can't pee, they can't do all sorts of things that are very important in the course of the day. Unless they're running in 5 minutes late to every meeting. So that's why that rule that you talked about is so important. We're thinking of making little styrofoam wedges for people because they just need something on the desk to remind them, or not the styrofoam, that squishy stress ball stuff, because that is the number one line of defense for burnout, is just to begin to open up some space in between all those meetings.
Well, and I took your principle to heart 2 years ago. When I first heard that, I said, I've got to get better at this. Now, I will say that my wife took it a step further. When I was telling her about my meeting overload, she said, well, why don't you do this? And obviously, we're talking about, within the world of professional work, white collar work. If your job is to, say, see patients all day, and that is an appointment, a meeting, you're probably going to have the colors touch or even overlap at times. But I know that with me, when it comes to team meetings, and the principle that is more aspirational than it is practical, is look at the first half of the day and the second half of the day, and try your best to only have one team meeting in each half of the day. And then it's literally, you don't have to worry about, what if I do this, or can I get this done? Like, you literally have most of each half of your day open for work if you don't over. So I have literally said no to meeting requests because I'm like, there's a 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. meeting, and at that time, I'm not going to do anything else, before noon, if I can help it. Again, there can be exceptions to that, but if you start off with a really strict standard, it's funny how, your mental health and your well-being increases, exponentially sooner than later. Yeah. So in my book, Make Work Better, I begin with the story of a humanitarian aid project that went really wrong. It was, again, best of intentions, but it led to disastrous results. And your book, and I don't want to spend too much time on this specifically, unless you think this is where we need to go. But you talk about, there was this great invention a couple decades ago called email, and everybody thought it's going to make work faster, communication easier. And it has gotten to be one of those drags on our humanity, right? Do you see anything happening right now, any trends that are being introduced into the world of work that have the best of intentions, but you think down the line, we're going to be talking in 20 years, oh, wow, look what we invented 20 years ago or started doing that's caused, harm in the workplace? Is there anything that you want to riff about?
Yeah, let's just start with Slack and just leave it at that. I'll just say the word Slack and I think that that's a really pernicious tool for people. But in terms of trends, I think that keeping cameras on all the time is a trend that is draining the life out of people. We've gone along for decades and decades and decades of business by talking to each other on the phone, and we got business done and we trusted each other. And so we do cameras off all the time. Cal Newport is pushing the research. I was pushing the research. Groups actually have a higher collective intelligence when they're spared all the distractions of cameras on all the time. So I think that's probably one that I would speak to. I think that return to office without careful consideration of the need for autonomy is probably going to be another one. I see the companies where they're mandating full-time RTO, and there's some very unhappy people that I think are going to leave them. And I don't think that they're finding a balance there. So I would probably say Slack, cameras on, and thoughtless RTO policies.
Yeah, that's good to know. And again, it's funny too, because you mentioned companies that have these return to office policies. We're on Zoom right now. And Zoom benefited greatly from teams going away from physical offices, but they also just a few weeks ago created a huge controversy by demanding that the majority of their workforce in one of their cities come back to the office. And again, just the irony. I just thought it was funny. It's like,
I didn't hear about that. Zoom made them come back to the
Zoom of all things, like, wait a minute, you guys have a tool that you invented that would cause remote workforces to work, and you're saying, no, come back to this high-rise commercial office building.
That's
So,
so funny.
So yeah. One of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, first of all, where can people, especially leaders, learn more about you? And then how do you work with business leaders to help their organizations? Because I know some of the work you've done for some organizations that we mutually know, but like, how is it that you work with companies? If there's a company leader listening to this, they're like, yes, we need her. What is it you offer, and how do they get in touch with you?
Oh, that's such a wonderful and generous question. We do believe that company leaders need an objective guide to get out of the woods that we've been describing. And we like to say that we're the best possible guide you can have in that light. We work with them consultatively. That's the leadership stuff that I talked to you about before, when I or one of our facilitators are in the room with the ELT, helping them really make changes from the top. But our main work is training larger populations. We want to get intact communities, that could be a line of business, a function, a geography, or a whole company together, and teach them those behaviors that I referenced earlier, where people are disempowered because they have not been taught the behaviors of self-care, saying no, prioritization, time management. They just don't know how to do it. It's amazing when you give them some simple tools like the wedge, how quickly they can change their circumstances. And that usually is we sometimes go in for a quarter, sometimes 7 weeks. It depends on the situation. But if there are leaders out there that would benefit from our objective counsel and our content, we would love to hear from them. You can just reach me at julietfunt.com. It's all one, JULIETFUNT.com.
Right. Very good. And again, I can't, for anybody that happens to be watching this, fly on the wall, cannot recommend this book more. A Minute to Think. And again, it's meaty, substantive, but you can literally read it in one weekend. And again, I have a whole, probably 4 sheets of notes of these are things I need to start taking action on right now to help even my company thrive. Because I think that's what we really have nowadays is we have a lot of companies that are doing business, a lot of companies that are obsessed about shareholder value, but their people aren't thriving, and therefore that company is not going to thrive long term. And that's what I love about the work you're doing, is that you're really going to help companies to thrive. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great to be with you.